Hello, bonjour, and welcome to the third webinar in our Community Education Forum series. I'm Angèle Bénard, National Director of Family Services for the Huntington Society of Canada. I would like to start today's session by acknowledging the lands on which we meet. I am joining you today from Sudbury, Ontario. The Greater Sudbury area is situated on the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 territory, as well as the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng, Anishinaabe, and Wahnapitae First Nations. Like many traditional territories, Anishinaabe has its own stories related to the land and environment that existed long before the arrival of settlers to this area. The Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe are descendants of the Ojibwe, the Algonquin, and the Odawa nations. I would encourage you to look up the territories on which you work and live. Miigwech. I'm excited to be here today to connect with you briefly in advance of our third virtual Community Education Forum, or CEF for short. It's certainly been a year of change and doing things in new ways, trying different technology, and getting used to seeing each other via screen instead of in person. We know that it's different from attending in person. However, we've all come through this together and have been able to share information, insight, and foster that all-important connection. Having the support of our fantastic HD community is all the more important during these challenging times. We continue to be amazed by the dedication and energy of volunteers, donors, researchers, and clinicians, and of course, the individuals and families facing and living with HD. Our session here today, focusing on genetic testing, highlights options available to members of the community. We at HSC believe in providing information about services and technologies available to help our HD community, so you are able to make decisions that are right for you and for your family as you navigate your HD journey. Before we get started, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Roche and Novartis for their generous sponsorship for today's event. Their support makes webinars like this possible, and we're appreciative of not only the support for today, but for other HSC events as well. Thank you. Merci. Now, let's go over some housekeeping items, including options for participating in today's event. When you join the presentation, the default setting is to listen through your computer speaker system. If you prefer to listen to audio over the telephone, just select phone call on the audio settings of your control panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit text questions at any time. Just type them in the questions box of your control panel and we will address them a little later on during the presentation. Now that we've had a quick overview of the how-tos for the webinar, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Clare Gibbons received a Master of Science degree in genetic counseling from Sarah Lawrence College in 1996 and then joined the genetics program at North York General Hospital in Toronto, where she currently works as the manager of clinical genetics. Throughout her career, she has participated in the care of a wide variety of patients and has been a member of the North York General Hospital Huntington disease multidisciplinary team for 20 years. Clare is currently a research coordinator for Enroll HD and has previously been involved in clinical drug trials for the treatment of HD. She has also been an investigator in clinical research studies involving computerized cognitive rehab for people with HD and talking to children about their risk for HD. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome her to our CEF session today. Clare, the screen is all yours.
Talk to you, sorry. So welcome to this virtual presentation on the genetic testing for Huntington's disease. Hopefully you will find the information provided today informative and helpful, and I look forward to fielding your questions at the end of this talk. Today's presentation will focus on a number of different areas. We'll start by talking about Huntington's disease, the genetics, the inheritance, and a little bit about the condition in general. We'll then talk about genetic testing for Huntington's disease, specifically how the testing is done, talk about what genetic tests will tell you, and the decision to be tested. Start with the inheritance of Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant genetic condition. And what that means is that it can affect males and females equally, and that we all have 2 copies of the HTT gene, which is the gene that's involved with Huntington's disease. Sometimes I'm going to refer to it as the HD gene just because it's a little bit easier than the mouthful of HTT. We all have 1 copy of the Huntington gene from our mother, and we have 1 copy from our father. If someone inherits 1 copy of the Huntington gene that does not work normally, that can cause symptoms of Huntington's. So remembering, if we have 2 copies, we can have just 1 that doesn't work normally and 1 that is normal, but then that person will still have Huntington's disease. So I'll show a diagram that will explain this. Here's an example of how Huntington's disease can be passed through family. In this example, we've used a man that has Huntington's disease to demonstrate this process, but as I said before, it could just as easily be a mother. So in this case, we have a man with Huntington's disease, and you can see he has 2 copies of the Huntington gene. The one that is capital here in orange, that is the one that would cause Huntington's disease. The second copy is functioning normally. When he goes on to have children, it's a 50-50 chance which gene he's going to pass to the children. You can see in some cases, he passes on the Huntington gene that will cause symptoms of Huntington's, and in other times he will pass on his normal copy. The child will inherit another Huntington gene from their unaffected parent. It could be either of these 2 genes, but since they're both working normally, it won't change the outcome. So by looking at this diagram, you can see that each child would have a 50-50 chance to inherit Huntington's disease. It's important to know that it's just like flipping a coin. So it doesn't matter what your brothers or sisters, what their result is, that won't change your chance. It would remain at 50-50. If we give an example of a family that has 2 children, it does not mean that one will have it and one won't. In real life, we see sometimes families where 2 children do have it, 2 children don't, or 1 does and 1 doesn't. Important to remember it's a 50% chance. We'll talk a little bit more about what the change is in the Huntington gene that actually causes symptoms of Huntington's. DNA is made up of 4 building blocks: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. We give them letters just to distinguish between them more easily. So that's A, T, C, and G. The Huntington gene has these building blocks of DNA in a very specific sequence. If you look at the sequence in the gene, we'll see that there's an area of the gene where the sequence is repeated over and over again: CAG, CAG, CAG. It's normal to have this repeated section in the Huntington gene, but what's important is the number of those repeats. When the number of those CAG repeats is over 40, that is called the full penetrance range. That means that if someone has in one of their genes 40 or more repeats, we would expect in a normal lifespan that they would show some symptoms of Huntington's. Another range is between 36 and 39 CAG repeats. That's called the reduced penetrance range. Someone who has this number could show symptoms of Huntington's in a normal lifespan, but some people do not. So not everyone that has 36 to 39 repeats will show symptoms of Huntington's, but there is the potential that they could. There's another range called the intermediate range, and that's between 27 and 35. Those individuals would not be expected to show symptoms of Huntington's, but it can have implications for future generations. And in a future slide, I'll talk a little bit about how this could happen. Any number that's under 27 is considered in the normal range. What we know about this CAG repeated area is that when the number is over 27, it can be unstable when it's passed on to the next generation. That means the number can change. We do see that this chance for the number to change happens more often when it's passed from a father to a child. It doesn't matter whether the child is a boy or a girl, but what is important is the transmitting parent. The number can change, it can get higher and it can get lower. But what we really want to focus on is when it gets higher and what those implications can be. So if we look at the intermediate range, someone who has between 27 and 35 repeats, who does not develop symptoms of Huntington's, But when this gene gets passed on to the next generation, the number of repeats could expand into that reduced penetrance or full penetrance range, and then their children would show symptoms of Huntington's. This can also happen with the numbers when it's over 36. And what we see in those cases is the number could expand into a larger range. And so you can see children showing symptoms at a younger age than the parents because there's been one of these expansions. So I'll show an example family just to kind of illustrate this, what this could look like. So here we have an example where there is a man at the top here in light blue with 34 repeats on one of his Huntington's genes and 18 on his other. The 34 falls in the intermediate range. He would not show symptoms, but when he has children, there's a chance that he could pass on this intermediate allele to his children. It's a 50-50 chance. In this example, the son has inherited that intermediate allele, except it is expanded to 39 and is now in the reduced penetrance range, which means there is a potential that he could show symptoms in the future. When he goes on to have children, there's a chance that when his 39 gets passed on to his child, that the number could expand even further. So in this example, he has a daughter who has 45 repeats, which is now in the full penetrance range. And we would expect that at some point in her lifetime, she would show symptoms of Huntington's. That daughter then has a child, and that son has inherited the 45 from his mother. Often when the repeats are passed from a mother to a child, we tend to see the number staying fairly close to that we see in the mother. Another example is if this man to his other son passed on the reduced penetrance allele, the 39, and it stayed the same in that son, but then that son has a child and the number has expanded even further to 60 in that daughter. With 60 repeats, we do tend to see a much earlier age of onset of symptoms. So that daughter of his may show symptoms much earlier than anyone else in the family because there's been this expansion in the CAG repeats. At this point, it probably would make sense to talk a little bit about the symptoms of Huntington's disease. There are three main components that we see affected in Huntington's disease. Motor, or the neurological signs, are the ones that are most common and the ones that are most unique to Huntington's disease. So the chorea, which is the involuntary movements, is actually what Huntington's chorea is named after. These involuntary movements can be slightly jerky, and the person is not aware or is not able to control those movements. Other neurological symptoms can be problems with balance, difficulty with walking, also affecting fine motor skills, so that would be things like handwriting. There can be swallowing problems, and also something called dystonia, which can be a stiffness, which is a neurological symptoms we sometimes see in the younger onset of this condition. Another area that can be affected is mood. People with Huntington's disease commonly experience depression, anxiety, and irritability. There can be other psychiatric issues, but these are not as common as the depression, the anxiety, and irritability. The challenge is that depression, anxiety, and irritability are very common even in the general population. So if we knew someone was at risk for Huntington's and had depression, we wouldn't necessarily think that that's a sign of Huntington's because it is just so common in the general population and could be present for so many other reasons. Another area that can be affected is the cognitive area. So an example of that would be problems with memory or problems with executive function. Executive function relates to being able to do complex tasks, multitask, and kind of sort out complicated problems. It's important to know that there are many different presentations with Huntington's disease. So not every person that has Huntington's disease will show all three of these symptoms. There can be some people that just show one of these or a combination. Also, the age that the symptoms can start is highly variable. Some can start at a young age, whereas others can be very late in life. The progression of the symptoms can also vary. In particular, motor and cognitive symptoms are expected to progress over time, but some people stay stable for many, many years, whereas others have a more rapid decline. In summary, if a parent has Huntington's, then each child would have a 50% risk to inherit Huntington's disease. It's possible to have Huntington's disease even if neither parent has symptoms, and that would be because a parent could have had an intermediate allele or could have had a reduced penetrance allele. Even another scenario could be a parent having a full penetrance allele, but not living long enough to potentially present with symptoms. Symptoms of Huntington's can differ from individual to individual, and the age the symptoms can start can also be different, and even within families. Okay. So, if you're thinking about genetic testing, sometimes it's useful to know, well, what can the genetic test tell me? The genetic test is done by taking a blood sample, and they will extract the DNA. Using a specific laboratory technique, they will then count the number of CAG repeats that that person has inherited. If they do the count and they find that both are under 27, then they can say that that person has not inherited Huntington's disease. If they do the count and they find one in the normal range, but one of the others in the expanded range, so 36 or more, they will say that person has inherited Huntington's disease. For people who have inherited 40 or more CAG repeats, that does mean that at some point in a normal lifespan, we would typically expect them to show some symptoms. However, it's not able to be more specific than that. CAG repeats do influence the age that symptoms start, but you cannot use the CAG repeat number to exactly predict when that person will show symptoms or how quickly those symptoms will progress. It can also not predict what symptoms that person may develop. So even though this test is very accurate to say whether someone has inherited the condition or not, there's still some things it's not able to tell you. Here's a diagram that shows the general trend towards the age of onset of disease. Along the bottom is the number of repeats, and along the side, the left-hand side here, it says the age of onset. So you can see in that reduced penetrance range, which is highlighted in pink here, that there's a huge range of age when the symptoms could start. As you move up the number of repeats, you can see the trend of the age goes down, but there's still a lot of variation between what age someone could show symptoms. So if we use 40 repeats as an example, you can see that here they say that typically the age of onset could be anywhere between 35 and over 60. So that's a huge spread, and it's not able to give exact numbers to each person about when to expect or how to plan for their future. Another thing to keep in mind is there's two different types of genetic testing, or more like reasons why we would do genetic testing. One is confirmation testing, and the other is predictive testing. Confirmation testing is done when someone has symptoms that we are trying to explain. So they would have some kind of neurological symptom. And the reason to go ahead with testing in that case is to understand, why does that person have symptoms, and perhaps to guide some medical management for that individual. Predictive testing is for people who have a family history of HD, know that they're at risk of inheriting HD, and would like to know if they have inherited the gene change, but they're not at this time showing any symptoms. Confirmation testing is often ordered through the genetics clinic, but it's also frequently ordered by neurologists or psychiatrists who are dealing with patients who have specific symptoms. Predictive testing, on the other hand, is recommended to be done through a genetics clinic. The genetics clinic has genetic counselors and geneticists that have specialized in going through this predictive testing process. They are there to help guide people through this process and to help make sure that they are making informed choices and that they have the support that they need to get through the process. Different genetics clinics across the country handle this slightly differently. So if you're wondering about the process in your area, I would reach out to the local clinic to find out. Some clinics require an assessment by a neurologist before going forward. Other clinics recommend having a Huntington social worker kind of step-by-step go through the process with the individual. Some clinics have 2 visits in person, others will have 4 visits. The important thing to know is that those clinics are just trying their best to be able to properly support people through such a complicated and often stressful process. And it is difficult to predict who is going to need the extra support through this process. Certainly there are some people who right from the beginning it is clear that they want or need the extra support, but we have had people who have really seemed like they were not, that they would manage very well through this process and in the end did need the extra support. So it is our philosophy to just go ahead and give as much support as we can to everyone, and that way we'll catch anyone who does benefit from having the support through the testing process. From speaking with people who have a family history of HD, we will refer to this as living at risk. And we've got a lot of feedback about what kind of impact that has on their day-to-day life. It's important to keep in mind that people living at risk, most of them are at 50% risk of developing Huntington's, but we do also sometimes see people who are at 25% risk. That happens when they have an affected grandparent instead of an affected parent. In that case, they have a grandparent who has been diagnosed with Huntington's, but their parent has not been tested and is not showing symptoms of HD, so their parent status is unknown. So in that case, it would be considered a 25% risk. The impact that living at risk for Huntington's disease has on an individual is extremely variable. Some people talk about it coming into their mind when they're thinking about the future and trying to plan for the future, whether or not that is planning a family, thinking about their career, timing of big events in their life, like when to retire. Often in that time, the at-risk status comes into their mind. Some people report to us that they're worried about what is to come and the uncertainty of the future. They find that they're watching for signs of Huntington's disease, perhaps even like feeling like they're under a microscope. When they forget their keys, where they put their keys, when they drop something, this may cause a lot more distress for them than to other people. They may also feel like other people in their family or friends are also watching them carefully for signs, and that can be stressful. The concerns and worries that go with living at risk for Huntington's vary from person to person and also over time, and depending on what stage of life the person's at may make a difference. Some people are able to put it out of their mind and really not think about it on a day-to-day basis and just go along and it not have a big impact. Others feel that it is constantly on their mind and it's something that's kind of following them every day. Sometimes certain stages of life or different things that are going on in your life will bring this to the forefront, like when there's a big decision to make about the future or perhaps dealing with a sick relative. So it's important to know that it doesn't stay static the whole time, that there can be variations. When people have been interviewed about why they might want testing, the feedback that we have gotten is that people often think about wanting to be tested for planning purposes, when they're planning a family, their finances, their career, their education. They want testing sometimes for relief from uncertainty. They just cannot living at risk any longer and just need to know an answer for sure. Some feel that they can get some control by knowing whether or not they're positive or negative for Huntington's. It gives them an opportunity to be prepared or not taken by surprise by things. Some people want to have testing because they hope or think the result will be negative. That is a bit of a risky reason to go for testing because, of course, sometimes we don't know, well, we do not know what the result will be until we get that actual result, and there can be surprises, and it can be difficult to deal with if that person has not been prepared for the possibility of getting a positive result because they've assumed that they will be negative. And more recently, we've had people coming forward because they're interested in participating in research. In particular, people have been asking about treatment trials. Currently, the treatment trials are enrolling people who have symptoms of Huntington's. So these would not be open to people who have no symptoms and are doing the predictive testing. But this certainly could change in the near future as more trials become available. There definitely could be some trials that would be open to different categories of people. And there currently are some research trials that are, research projects like Enroll HD, which is an observational study where people can participate when they don't have symptoms, or even, to be honest, the at-risk people are able to be eligible into that research study, which is really collecting information about Huntington's disease. Some reasons that people have given for not wanting to be tested is that they would prefer to wait and deal with it when they need to deal with it. Because currently there isn't any preventable treatment or medications that we can recommend at this point. And so they may feel that there's not so much of a reason to go ahead and be tested. Some will feel that there's a loss of hope. They prefer to kind of live with the uncertainty because that means that there's a chance that they didn't inherit Huntington's, and they want to hold on to that possibility. Some people avoid testing because they fear discrimination. We have legislation in Canada currently that protects genetic test results. That means that an employer or an insurance company cannot ask for your genetic test result. But sometimes the discrimination may be kind of more vague than that and just feel that people might start treating them differently. And this could even be family or friends. There are a number of things to consider when thinking about whether this is the right time to go ahead for genetic testing. One is think, how will I emotionally handle this information? How have I handled stressful things and events in my past? Have there been things that I was able to do that helped me to get through those difficult times? And if so, maybe I want to put those in place before I consider testing. So if in the past during stressful events, I felt that it was helpful to speak to a therapist or use certain medication to help with that, or keep myself busy or exercise, I may want to have these things in place and make sure that I'm ready when I go ahead for testing. Also ask, what impact is this information going to have on those around me? Certainly going ahead for testing is going to have implications for a person's partner, and it can also have implications and effect on the family members and their loved ones. Another point to consider is, what will my results tell me? So what do I want to get out of these results? Is knowing that I'm positive or negative going to be something that will be useful, even though it's not able to give me exact information about when I would have symptoms or what those symptoms would be? Can I think of any benefits to knowing my Huntington's status? So are there things that I would be able to use this information for planning or for preparing? And finally, is the timing right? It's important not to feel rushed or feel the need to rush into going ahead for testing. Once you get your test results, there's no way to go back from that. You will know those results. However, if you're not sure the timing is right, you can wait till next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, however long you need. So do not feel rushed, even if other people in their family are going ahead for testing, or if there's some, you feel that everyone's talking about going for testing. Do what's right for you and pick the time that's right for you. I will share a little bit of information about some studies and what people, a little bit about people's reasons, statistics on people getting tested. This is more just to show that there really isn't a right or wrong answer for testing, and that lots of people make lots of different decisions. You probably hear this thrown around that a relatively small number of at-risk people have predictive testing for Huntington's. This was a bit of a surprise because when the test was being developed, the feedback that people had got from the HD community was that they would all want to be tested. When the test was offered, we found that not everyone came forward. And I think that it's really important that even though in theory it might sound like a good idea to be tested, there's a lot of things to consider and that it's important to make sure the timing is right. A recent paper from the UK calculated that less than 20% of at-risk people came forward for testing. So certainly, if you're on the fence, do not feel that just because the test is there that you should go ahead with testing. I would also caution, on the other hand, to say that if you feel that testing is right for you, that is all right as well. I'm not sure that 4 out of 5 people have specifically chosen not to be tested, because these papers are really calculating this based on the population probability that there are population numbers of how many at-risk people are out there. And we don't know a lot about that 4 out of 5 people who aren't coming forward. Some may be doing it because are not coming forward because they're young. Some may not even really realize that they're at risk. But the important thing to know is that many people come forward for testing and many people choose to wait. Another thing to keep in mind is that once you've started on the testing process, you do not have to continue on with it. So there's been studies that look at how many people who come in for their first appointment follow all the way through to receiving their results. And this is across the world. There were some areas of the world that seemed like a very high number completed the process, where others showed that only a small number. And I would say here, from our experience at North York General, that it's somewhere in between that. We have a number of people who come in for the first session, and after hearing the information and weighing the pros and cons, decide not to go ahead with testing, and that is fine. There's no pressure that after coming in for that first visit that you would have to follow through and be tested. In fact, we even have people who have their blood drawn and they choose this, and they have their blood drawn, the test is done, we call to set up a results appointment, we keep it in a sealed envelope and we don't know what those results are, and that person says, you know what, hold on to that envelope for a while, I'll let you know when I'm ready. And that is perfectly fine as well. So important to know that there isn't a right way or a wrong way. There's just the way that's right for you. This information here is just to give just kind of an overview about some demographics of people who have come forward for testing. What they found is in the first 7 years they offered the test, all different age groups came forward for requesting testing. The next 7 years, they saw a shift towards the younger age group. And in the most recent 7 years, they found a bit of a double peak where they found a number of people in their 20s coming forward, and then another group of people in their late 40s and 50s coming forward for testing. Who knows what the next 7 years will look like, especially depending on what happens with research and treatment trials. But it's interesting to know that there's many different trends and changes that happen as far as who's coming forward for testing. For that group where we saw the peak in the 20s and then again in the 50s, when they asked those individuals why they were coming forward for testing, I think it becomes a little more clear about kind of what the motivations were. So for the age group in their 20s, the common reason to come forward was a planning around children and the future generation. Whereas the people in their 40s were doing it because it was more to give information for their children. So presumably the children were perhaps asking about their risk, and that knowing if their parent had Huntington's would help them for their future planning. So you can see the difference between the ages and the motivation for coming forward for testing. In the bottom graph, it shows that overall, there are some people who are coming forward specifically just to eliminate doubt without a specific plan or reason why, but they just don't want to live at risk any longer and want a definite answer. So it's important to kind of think about the two possible outcomes of testing if you choose to go forward. One is testing positive and the other is testing negative. So if someone tests positive, we recommend that they give themselves time to adjust to this information. It's natural to feel that that the person's mood will go down and there will be that dip. That was perfectly understandable and expected. When we've looked at people over time, found that usually about a year after they've received results, the person's mood has returned to about the same level as it was pre-test. So often the people who've come forward for testing have come forward because they are feeling some kind of stress related to their at-risk status. And even though after testing positive, they may feel a dip in their mood, by 1 year, often they're back to that similar level that they were prior to testing. That's just an average. Of course, there's some people who may need more help and that adjustment period may take longer. It's really important to have identified a support network, and that could be a professional or personal support network. Professional would be the genetic counselor and geneticist in the genetics clinic, the Huntington social workers, perhaps the person's own individual counselor or therapist, and also to find personal support. So not that we're suggesting that enlist the whole entire family, but a couple of core people, friends or family, that are really there just to support that person. When someone is feeling down or having difficulty adjusting, it can be really hard to reach out and ask for help. So having that personal or kind of close person that can help you to reach out and know where to get help would be very useful. Often we're asked about whether or not there's any preventative options available. So there's a lot of things that we're hoping that will be coming in the future. Currently, the only thing that we do suggest to people is about staying active and exercising and also keeping mentally active. There are some studies that have shown that physical activity certainly can be beneficial, but currently do not have any medications that we can suggest for prevention at this time. People can use the information as far as planning. In particular, often it comes up about family planning and about how to test for pregnancies or embryos. So some people may choose to do prenatal testing. Others may be doing pre-implantation genetic testing, which is the testing of embryos. If that's something that you're interested in, we would recommend reaching out to your local genetics clinic, because what's available and the cost of those options may differ from geographic region. So your local clinic will be the best ones to tell you about what's available near you. If you're positive, you may be wanting to join treatment trials if you're eligible and willing to take on that commitment. As I mentioned before, those trials currently are mainly focusing on people who have symptoms, but I would highly recommend staying in contact with the Huntington Society of Canada or watching HD Buzz to see what's on the horizon and what's coming up, so that you can be connected in if there's something that you're eligible for or interested in. You can also join the observational trials if they're available in your area, like Enroll HD. There are a number of projects that do enroll asymptomatic positive people, even at-risk people. So, take a look at what's available in your area and certainly reach out if you're interested in any of those. This is an interesting topic to bring up, because people often assume that if they test negative that they're going to feel wonderful and there's nothing to think about in this particular scenario. It actually turns out often to be a bit more complicated than the person expected. Even though I would say that most people are very happy and relieved if they get a negative test result, it is important to kind of consider how it could have impact on relationships. If you can imagine a family of 3 children where 2 test positive and 1 test negative, there could be very complicated dynamics around that, revealing that test result to the other brothers or sisters who have tested positive, and could be very complicated as far as how you interact perhaps with the parents. So it is important to kind of think about those dynamics when considering a negative test. Also, sometimes people have framed their entire life at being at risk or potentially getting Huntington's in the future. And once that's taken out of the picture, it makes them having to readjust to a new reality and a new kind of future for them. And that can also take some time as well. So it is really important for people to be prepared for both possible outcomes. And finally, just want to finish on this note. This is a little picture that I took the other day when I was feeling a bit down about winter and brought a little bit of spring into the house. And I feel like this is really what we're kind of seeing with HD is that we have so many exciting and hopeful things that are going on. I think we're getting a bit of a glimpse of hopefully what is to come in the future. And the hope that being tested for HD or inheriting HD will mean something very different in 5-10 years from now than it does at this point. And that we're really hopeful that all of the amazing research that's going on and the treatment trials will really make a difference for this condition. Okay, so that is the end of my talk, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Claire. As always, I appreciate the way you share your knowledge on this topic with compassion and insight. We will now begin answering any questions you have regarding the presentation. And as a reminder, you can submit text questions through the question box in the control panel. All right, so the first question we have, Claire, if one is HD positive with a repeat of 40, and it's the same as the parent who had the late onset HD, is there a good chance that you would also have late onset?
Well, and that's a good question. This is where it is very difficult to really extrapolate from the repeat numbers, because even within the same family, we've had, say, 2 people with the same number of repeats, and we can use 40 as an example, and had a 15 or 20-year difference in the ages of onset. Certainly, we wouldn't expect a very early onset. So if someone said, would you think it's likely the person would show symptoms, let's say at 25 years of age, if you have 40 repeats, then it would be quite unlikely. So you can kind of look at this like likelihood, but not really able to say a definite answer that it's going to be early or late. There is some of the research projects that are like Enroll HD has been trying to kind of look into this to see if there's anything else that modifies the age of onset to try to understand why there's so much variability and why it's so difficult to predict the at what age symptoms will start just based on the CAG repeats.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, you mentioned that the mother's gene stayed stable when passed down. So that means it would not decrease either?
So we can sometimes see small increases or decreases. Usually if there's going to be a change, it's usually a small number of repeat change. So, you know, between, let's say, 1 and 3 kind of getting bigger or smaller. And certainly we have seen in some cases that there's been what we'll call a contraction. But again, with a mother to a child, the number of repeat changes tends to be small. The concern happens more because with a father, we can see the really big jumps, you know, where you have someone who has, you know, that, like, let's say 40 repeats, and then a child with a very high number and is going to start showing symptoms at quite a young age. And that's why we focus so much more on the male transmission. However, sometimes it can stay the same even when it comes from a male, or even contract when it comes from a male as well. That's also another area that the research projects are trying to understand why there's the instability, and sometimes the number of CAG repeats can be passed through the family for many, many generations without there being changes, and others we see frequently these big changes. And is there something that's kind of different about those specific individuals that explains this? But that is still kind of under investigation at this point.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain the chart with the number of CAG repeats related to age? For example, if someone started HD symptoms at 20, what is usually the range of the CAG repeat?
Well, that is good. I don't know that I would know that off the top of my head. We'd have to kind of do a reverse thing of the chart. I mean, certainly, you know, when we're talking about juvenile HD, and that is symptoms under the age of 20, typically they're looking at 60 repeats or more. So that's kind of a number, but it can be like really, if we start to see someone with symptoms, the most accurate way to figure out their repeats is to do the genetic testing. It's hard to kind of extrapolate backwards.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, if I'm looking to get tested and I'm located in the Toronto area, what would you recommend for a first step? Who would I reach out to?
Yeah, so I think I can speak to Ontario, and this may apply to other provinces as well, but what we would like is most of the genetics clinics around Ontario would want a referral from a family doctor, and that's really all we would need to get the process started and connect with that person.
Okay, great. Are insurance companies able to ask if a parent has HD? And if the answer is yes, can they compel you to be tested before deciding to approve a premium?
So that is a good question. So the legislation protects around the genetic testing. So they cannot compel you to have a genetic test. They cannot ask for your genetic test result. However, at this time, an insurance company could still ask about a family history of Huntington's. So that is where they can still get the information. But if the person responds to say they have a family history of Huntington's, the insurance company cannot make them have a genetic test.
Okay, great, thank you. So I know at one point you talked about the 50% chance of having or inheriting the gene. Can you talk a little bit more about how that spreads out through, let's say, 4 siblings? Because sometimes we hear from families between siblings, it becomes a game of odds almost. So can you just go over that again?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really kind of the interesting thing about trying to talk about probabilities. So it really is, if you imagine taking a coin and flipping it, and you can say heads is Huntington's and tails is not. If you take that coin and flip it 4 times, you could get many different combinations. And just because you flipped it and you got heads, the next time you flip that coin, it's a 50% chance again. So if we were to look at 4 children that in a family and we tested all of them, you could have, and we can go through the combos, you can have 4 that got Huntington's, or another option is 4 that did not, 3 that did and 1 that didn't, or 3 that didn't and 1 that did, and then 2 and 2. It could be any of those combinations. And, you know, so certainly I've had, you know, even if we have, let's say, 2 sisters that come in and one tests negative, and then the other says, well, then I must be the positive one. And of course, you have to remind them that's not the case. Your chance is still 50-50. It doesn't matter what your brother or sister's result is. So that just is a very important thing to kind of to remember and to think, even though I think your head can think that way, sometimes I think it is hard for people not to feel like, especially if you have a family of 4 and 3 didn't get it, you might kind of feel like surely my odds are that I'm the one that got it. But and I can understand how someone may kind of feel that way, but in a logical kind of real math way and biological way we see it, it doesn't change. It's 50-50 for each person.
Okay, thank you. The next question is around, this is an adult who's at risk and their parent is also at risk, but the parent doesn't want to get tested, but the adult child wants to get tested. Can they still go with testing at that point?
Yes, and that was a bit of the scenario that we kind of were talking about. So this person who presumably has a grandparent that has been diagnosed with Huntington's and a parent who has not had testing and is not showing symptoms. So this person would that has asked this question would be at 25% risk. And there's been a lot of debate about what to do in that situation, because if that person comes forward and gets tested and they test positive, then it is revealed what their parents' test result would be. And so in that case, it again can cause some issues around the family dynamics, because now they will know some information that impacts on their parent, and their parent may have had very specific reasons about why they didn't want to know their HD result. So that all has to be kind of factored in for that person's, the child's decision to go ahead with testing, and really think through, is this the right choice for me at this point? And ultimately, if the child really feels it's absolutely important for them to know their HD status, then that takes priority over the parent's right not to know. There's been a number of studies and consortiums kind of looking at that, and that is something that is consistently agreed on worldwide, that the person's right to know does take precedence over the person's right not to know. But hopefully with the genetics clinic, we can kind of talk through this, and there's preparation, because it is a bit of a complex situation. If that child goes ahead and is tested negative, then it hasn't revealed anything about their parent's status. It doesn't mean their parent's negative. It just means their parent is still at risk. But at least there's nothing that we don't have any information that the parent doesn't know about. It's really if that child tests positive that it becomes complicated and can have a lot of implications for the rest of the family.
Okay, thank you. So we're saying that HD is a genetic condition, and in this question, the individual says, well, it's new to our family, and we're not sure where it came from. How does that happen?
Yes, so the possibilities, and I mean, this is something that often people kind of wonder about, is the possibilities is that one of the parents could have even in that intermediate allele range. So that's the 27 to 35 range, where people who have those repeat numbers would not show symptoms. They could live into their 80s and never show symptoms, but it is unstable. And in a future generation, or in even the next generation, that number can go up to the affected range, and then that person will show symptoms. So even though historically, when we went, when Huntington's was first described a couple hundred years ago, they said you had to have a parent with HD in order to have HD. But now that we understand the genetics and that instability, we realize that that's not the case, and there can be the first cases in the family due to the change in the number of repeats as it's passed from generation to generation. If that family is interested, if the parents are living, they could test them. Why would that be useful is because if there is an intermediate allele in the family, it would be maybe helpful to know which side of the family has that intermediate allele, and alert those people that they could be at risk, or their children could be at risk for Huntington's in the future.
Another question is coming in around the pre-implementation genetic testing. So is it true that you can do pre-implementation genetic testing without divulging the status of a person, or I guess of a parent's status?
Yes, so I know that often at the Huntington's conferences, we usually do this talk, and then which is about predictive testing, and then we also usually have a whole separate talk about kind of the family planning and those options, because the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so we call it PGD or PGT as in Tom, is an area that people are very interested in. It is, in theory, possible to do testing of the embryos without knowing the status of the parent. So where the parent doesn't go ahead with testing, they just know that they have a chance to have inherited Huntington's. Anytime they're doing pre-implantation genetic testing, we often would need blood samples from a number of family members in order to be able to do that testing. So if that is something that that person's interested in, I would suggest, even if you're thinking, I don't want to go to the genetics clinic to talk about testing for myself, I want to find out about how I could do PGT, then I would suggest meeting with them, because then they can work through that information with you and sort out what would be needed. And that would be best done based on your specific family history. But in theory, yes, it is possible to do that.
Okay. The next question is a little bit along the same lines, but if the person does want to know their own status, they're not necessarily interested in the PGT, are there other family planning options available to them?
Mm-hmm. So sometimes people will consider using an egg or a sperm donor as a way, as a different option. And adoption, of course, we have some people who have chosen that route. And also the prenatal testing, which is through the amniocentesis or the CVS. But that is also, that technique is challenging when the person doesn't know their status. But again, in theory, there is a way to do it, to test the fetus without knowing the parent status. But I think, kind of reading between the lines for this question, I'm probably thinking egg or sperm donor may be what would best answer that question.
Okay, great, thanks. And what are the typical wait times to get an appointment or to get the results from the genetic testing process?
So I believe that probably varies significantly across the country. So I'm going to probably say that the range is probably anywhere from a month or two to longer, depending on the resources in that specific area. And for the laboratories, again, depending on their volumes, probably 1 to 2 months for the laboratory portion of the test. So we have the test to get the wait to get in to see the genetics clinic, and then the laboratory kind of wait. This is brings up a good question. I know this is a little tangential, but we've been having some discussions with some of the pharmaceutical companies that are looking at the treatments for developing the treatments for Huntington's disease. And one of their concerns and questions has come up: if there is all of a sudden a treatment available, how are the genetics clinics going to handle the demand, perhaps significant increase in demand for genetic testing? And so I will kind of reassure everyone that, this is something that's being worked on, is being considered, that if something becomes available and there's a sudden demand for testing, and there's really hopefully something that would be able to help those individuals, like with their medical management, that we will find ways to get as many people through as quickly as possible. So the wait times that we have at this point would be different, because again, things would change. I think the whole kind of debate around predictive testing will be completely different if there's actual preventions and treatments that are available. And so perhaps we'll be able to get people moving through the process much more quickly.
Okay, thank you. This question asks about, does the gene count inherited change if it is given to a male child or a female child?
So at this point, we don't see any difference. It's the transmitting parent that makes the difference. So whether it's passed from a father makes a difference for the statistical likelihood that there'll be an increase, as opposed to passed from a mother. But if the child is a boy or a girl, we have not seen any difference between those two.
Okay. This one is around parents discussing it with their children. So what age do you recommend starting to have the discussion with your children about genetic testing?
So this is an again, usually it could be a whole presentation, but in a nutshell. So the first thing to know is that each family is different. So there isn't really a right or wrong answer for what the right age is. Typically, what most families find works well for them is to kind of give the information pieces of information over time, starting first with the child knowing that there's Huntington's disease in the family, or that there's a condition in the family, and progressing with these pieces of knowledge up to the point of the actual child's risk. You know, typically the average age to kind of find out about HD and the fact that it's inherited tends to be kind of the early teenage years, just because often the children have the maturity to kind of understand what's the implications at that time. And also it may be kind of something that they are asking about or wondering about because of what they're seeing in the family. But, you know, there have been people who have told children at a younger age and it's been the right thing for them to do, and other people who have waited until, you know, later than early teens to tell their children. So it's something that you just have to judge your own child's maturity and ability to handle the information, as well as what's going on in the family. Sometimes having a parent with HD might necessitate the discussion to come up earlier than if it's a grandparent or a more distant relative.
Okay, thank you. Is there research regarding stress management and the age of onset?
So I have not been able, like at this point, we don't have any definite things that they've been able to say cause Huntington's to develop sooner. Certainly from our own experience at North York General, if people are under stress, if they have symptoms, they tend to be, you know, manifest more. So, you know, we definitely find if we can reduce the anxiety or depression of the person, and if, you know, that may help with some of their, you know, motor symptoms, but it's not exact. So, and it's certainly not about like the onset of symptoms. So it's not that we've been able to prove that it's shown that they've come on sooner, only that, you know, when people are fatigued or distressed, symptoms that they already have may be more obvious. But there's not been any studies that have been able to give any definitive causes of onset starting sooner. Like they've looked at, you know, does alcohol consumption, drug consumption, different medications, different genetic variabilities. The genetic variabilities is one that is quite promising to try to see that there may be some genes that give, like other genes other than the Huntington gene, that protect, in other words, kind of delay onset, and some that cause it to happen earlier. And I think that that's probably a little bit easier to study than some of the things like how do you define stress and how do you define anxiety, and trying to kind of sort that out would be something that might be difficult to really do a scientific study to prove that it's having an effect.
Okay, thank you. We're going to switch gears a little bit again and go back to the genetic testing process. And the person asks, if I had a previously sealed test done, am I still able to access those results?
Yeah, so you should be able to. They would be stored, sealed somewhere, presumably. So you could go back to that clinic. Now, likely they're going to want to at least, you know, not just bring you in for a results session, because part of the process of the testing is making sure the person's prepared. So if you went through the beginning part of the test process many years ago, then they'll want to meet with you just to do a check-in. You know, what's changed? Are you feeling the timing is right? What do you have in place to prepare for these results? But potentially you may not have to have your blood drawn again, and maybe shortly after that initial assessment you'll be able to get your results. It may depend on how long ago. So many years ago, here at North York General that does some of the testing, the Huntington's testing for Ontario, they weren't reporting the repeat sizes. And that was just because there was some concern, because we didn't want people to put so much weight on their repeat sizing, like, oh, well, I have 42 repeats, which means at age 52, I'm going to have symptoms. So I think that was part of the reason they were hesitant to report it. But of course, now people want to know their repeats. And for some research studies, it actually can be quite helpful to know the number of repeats. So if you've had your genetic testing done many years ago, and I'm going to say probably like year 2000 or earlier, they may not have the repeat number on it, and so you may want to have your blood redrawn and have it tested so that you can get that information.
Okay, great. I think that was our last question. So
it's funny because I must have talked really fast through my presentation, because when I did the practice, it took a lot longer. So the excitement of talking to everybody.
Oh, I think it was wonderful. I think yeah, from what I'm seeing, we've covered off all the questions. So what I say to those that are participating today is I encourage you to connect with your regional family services team member if you have specific questions around the genetic testing process in your area, or any other HD related questions that you may have. You can find a list of the family services team workers on the Huntington Society website. Claire, I would like to thank you again for your presentation. We appreciate you sharing your experience and your counsel with us. You've been so generous of your time, and I'm confident that I speak for the whole community when I say how thankful we really are.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
I'd also like to thank again the Roche and Novartis for their generous sponsorship of today's virtual community education forum. Their valuable support makes events like this possible. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed our three-part community education forum series. I would like again to thank our speaker, Claire, one last time. And on behalf of the Huntington Society, I also want to thank the audience for taking the time to join our session. Please share your feedback with our events team so that we can make future webinars even better. Now, I can't let you go without mentioning our next big event. We are having our first ever virtual national conference happening on March 27th in 2021, this year. It's free, and you'll have a front row seat to the standout roster of informative speakers, all from the comfort of your own home. You can register online at the Huntington Society website, and the link, as well as more information, are all located there as well. So please go check out the conference webpage at the HSC website. Remember, even if you can't join us live, you can pre-register, and that pre-registration means that you will have access to the recordings of the sessions even after the event. With that, I would like to say thank you, un gros merci, and goodbye to everyone. À bientôt.